Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. It's been a little while since I last made a video, but I'm very excited for today's video. I've been wanting to make this video for a while now, but haven't gotten a chance to get around to it. What I want to do today is I want to show you how to build a CI/CD pipeline using GitHub Actions. Now, what CI/CD stands for is continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment, depending on what exactly the pipeline does. I will talk a little bit about that towards the end of the video. But if you've ever pushed code to a GitHub repository and wondered, how do I get this out to production or into the wild, this is the video for you. A CI/CD pipeline is responsible for getting your code from your repository out to production. And so what we're going to cover in this video is the manual process for deploying. So if you were deploying a service manually, how that would look. I think understanding this is very important for understanding the automation. The second part is we're going to write the automation, and that's going to be in GitHub Actions. So that's going to be our CI/CD pipeline. And then the third part, we're going to discuss that continuous delivery versus continuous deployment part and talk about the differences there and what makes a pipeline continuous delivery pipeline versus a continuous deployment pipeline. So let's get started. I do apologize ahead of time. My voice may be a little raspy. I've been a little bit sick the last few days, so if you hear a little bit of a raspiness, that's why. But anyways, let's jump in and let's deploy a service manually to begin with. Okay, so I'm sitting here in a repository called the User Management Service CI/CD, which is a Golang repository that manages users. So it allows you to create users and get users, essentially. The details of what the service does is not too important. Really, what we want to focus on here is how do we get this service from the repository out to production, and that is what we're going to cover here. So in the README, if we head down to the section that says deploying the service, this describes how we would deploy the service manually. Now, in any CI/CD pipeline, there is really three steps. The first step is you want to validate that the code you are deploying to production is good. And so a common pattern for doing this is by running unit tests. Now, obviously, this is as good as the tests are. If the tests are bad, then potentially the validation of how good if the service is good for production or not will not be great, but we're going to assume here that the tests are great, and so we're going to run the go test functionality to run our Golang tests and validate that the service is good to go to production. The second part is really wrapping that service into either a binary. In this case, we're going to build a container image and we're going to push it to registry, which is a common pattern in modern software development, but this is really the part where we build the service and get it ready so that it can run in production. So that's kind of the building and getting it out to where it needs to be so it's available for the production servers to grab. And then the third part here is really kind of linked to the second part, but is really updating some kind of configuration files that say, hey, this is the new binary I want to be running. And then depending on whether we're doing delivery or deployment, this is a little bit different, but that's the third part. We're essentially going to update some sort of configuration file that defines the deployment that's in production to say, this is our new binary, I want you to run this now. So let's get started. First off, it says here we need to run a local version of our database so that we can run our unit tests. And we're just going to follow the instructions. We're going to first export the environment variables that it says here. So I'm going to head over to the terminal. I'm just going to export these. Oh, I missed one. So let's make sure we get all of them. Okay. And then next is Docker Compose up. Now Docker Compose is a Docker utility that allows us to set up a configuration file, Docker Compose configuration file that then allows us to spin up multiple containers in one go. The details are not too important. It's more about knowing that this is the process we're going to be using to manage our service when it's running, both locally and in production is the idea here. We will run this Docker Compose up. One thing to note before running this, if you're following along, you do need to have Docker on your machine. I'm using Docker Desktop, which is the way to go. So Docker Desktop is the easiest way to get Docker on your machine. So I recommend that if you are following along. And I'm essentially going to copy this command here. I'm going to head over to the terminal and I'm going to run Docker Compose up. Okay, and so that starts our two containers. There's two there. There's the Dynamo local container, which is our database, and the user management service. For the unit test, this part here is not important. To make it easier, we don't want to separate this out, so we just spin both up locally. We will test the service as well once we build the image, but for now, what we care about is that this database is running locally for us so that we can run our unit tests. And if you have Docker Desktop, you can also see them here. They've been running for 32 seconds. And just to show you that Docker Compose file, it's under the deploy folder here in the repository, and it just describes those two services, the database, and then this is the service of the repository. Okay, so once we have the database up, we do need to make sure that the table is created for our database, and the way to do that is with the script. So if we take a look at that script, it's already here for us. It essentially just makes a call to our local DynamoDB database, and it creates a table. And so we just want to run the script to make sure that the table is created so that when the unit tests run, they can save the users to the table. So let's do that. Go to the README, copy the line directly, and okay, so I did mess up on the README that I wrote. We do not want to copy the line directly because the path is actually under scripts/dynamo create table sh. So let me actually fix that README right now. So it's actually scripts dynamo db create table. All right, so let's run the script. All right, perfect. So the script succeeded. We now have a table created. And then if we go back to the README, it tells us we can now run our unit tests. And so we simply run go test -v, and this is Go syntax for running all the unit tests. So it's going to pick up any file with test in it if we run this command. So let's go back to the terminal. And everything passed, so that validates that what we were going to build, as far as we know, given the unit test we have, is good to go. Okay, so the second part here is to build and push the image to the registry. We're going to be using the GitHub Docker registry. So, but really, this is really you can use any registry you want. It's easy to use the GitHub one because it's free to use. So I recommend using this one if you're following along. So the first thing we want to do is we want to log in to that registry so that we have permission to push once we build that image. So this here is exporting a token. The one thing I'll say about the token that you do export is you need to make sure that this token has access to packages. The container is under packages. Just to make that clear, if you head over to settings, and you go down to developer settings, you have all your personal access tokens. What you want to make sure when you build that token is that you give it access to packages. It needs to be able to write packages and read packages so that it can push to the container registry for GitHub. If it doesn't have access to that, it won't be able to push. So just want to make sure your token has that, and yeah, that's it. Okay, so you want to run the export token so that the token is available when you log in. I've already exported my token, so other than that, you can run this here to log in to the GitHub Docker registry. So I'm going to head over to the terminal, and I'm going to run that. And make sure you do actually put in your username, because if not, it will not work. So my GitHub username is Samir Marin, so run that. And then login succeeded. Okay, so once we're logged in, we can then build our image and push it to the registry. So back to the README. So to build the image, we can run a Docker build with specifying the tag. Now we already have the Docker file and everything in here. We don't need to worry about that, but just for reference, this is the Docker file. This is what's going to be used to build our image, and then after that, we're going to push our image out to our GitHub container registry. To build our image, we just copy the Docker build /tag. We copy that in, and we change the tag. We can say that's CI/CD. It can be really anything you want. I'm going to call it CI/CD tag, just for reference, and then dot, because our Docker file is in our root. And then we do this. This will build the image. Okay, now that that's done, what we want to do is we want to push the image. So we want to then come over back to the README, and we just want to run Docker push and then reference to the image tag we just used. So we'll copy this in, and then the image tag we just used, was CI/CD tag, and so we pushed that up, and this is what we needed to log into the GitHub container registry for, so that we could push up to the registry. So we can, now that we've pushed that up, we can actually go check if that got pushed up. We head over to the repo. We have these packages here. We can click on the package, and then we can see that we just pushed this up a minute ago with the tag CI/CD. And so this is what we just pushed up. So that's great. Okay, so let's head back over to the README and let's see the next step. So the next step here is to update the Docker Compose file with the new tag. And we're gonna do this locally. So I already have this repo cloned. I'm gonna open it up in Cursor. And then I have the Docker Compose file here under the deploy. And what I wanna do is I wanna update this here to that new tag I just pushed up, which was the CI/CD tag. And really, that is the last part. And so the reason we do this is because this part here is, okay, now that we've built the tag, the image, pushed it up to registry, we need to tell the configuration of our deployment to use that tag. And this is really what that's all about. We just update that Docker Compose configuration and say, hey, this is the new tag that you're going to use now to run the service. And we can actually test that out locally by running, since this is what we're already running Docker Compose up, we just run another Docker Compose up to update it to use that latest image. So if I go back over to the terminal and just run another Docker Compose up detach, it will just update it to that newer image. And you see it was restarted because it's now, it pulled that latest image and it's now using the new image. And if we wanted to validate that this is all working, since we're running this in Docker containers, we can actually make some requests. So in the README, it talks a little bit about how to do that. There's a way to make a curl request, to create a user, and how to get a user. And so we could do that. I'm not gonna use curl, I'm gonna just use Postman to make this a little bit easier. I already have that all set up. So here I have, this is running under 1324, and you can see that by referencing, I mean, it's in the README, but also if you look at the Docker Compose file, you can see the ports that it's running on. So we can test that out. Run a request to the create, and it says user created, and then we can do a request to get the user, which is also described in the README. If you go and you see the README, this is a typo. Should be get a user. So get a user, and if we come back to the Postman and run that, we can see that's the user we just created. And so the service is running, and it's able to receive requests and reply to us. And so you can imagine that if this was in production, you would run a Docker Compose up on the production machine, and it would then update to use that latest image that you built and pushed up to the container registry. So now that we've seen the manual process, we're gonna head over and do this with GitHub Actions. So we're gonna automate this exact same process with GitHub Actions, and that is going to be our CI/CD pipeline. Okay, so let's build that CI/CD pipeline using GitHub Actions. So first things first, I'm going to head over to Cursor. I'm using Cursor as my code editor. So anytime you want to build a GitHub Actions workflow in a GitHub repository, you want to place that under .github/workflows. And then under the workflows directory, you want to add your workflow file, which is a YAML file. And I'm going to call this CI/CD pipeline. But really, you can call this a file whatever you want. That name doesn't really matter as long as it's a YAML file. Okay, so first things first, at the top, you just want to give the workflow a name. I'm going to take the suggestion Cursor is giving me here, which is great. Then we want to run a workflow. Anytime you run a workflow, you need to set on the on keyword, which is the trigger. And I'm going to actually take these suggestions by Cursor, but I'm going to change them a little bit. So we do want the on trigger for the push, and we want that to be on the main branch. That means this workflow will run anytime there is a push to the main branch, but we also want this to trigger on a pull request that is compared against the main branch. So Cursor there was really nice at giving us suggestions, so I'm taking those. And then for the jobs though, I do want jobs, but the first job I actually want is the test job. So okay, So we get the setup, and then we want to do the runs on Ubuntu latest. That's correct. And then the steps we want are, so Cursor is giving us some suggestions, which is more or less correct, but not quite exactly what we want. We do want to check out the code. We do want to set up Go, but we actually want to use the V5 version because that is the latest. And here we want to actually use a Go version file, and we want to use the Go mod to get our Golang version. We don't want to specify the version directly. And then we do want to run the test, but we also need to make sure our database has the proper setup before we run the test. So to do that, we want to do a Docker compose up so that Docker compose builds our database. And we're not going to point to the deploy folder here because we actually have a separate Docker compose that just has a database, which is really all we need in the root. It just defines the database for us. So we're going to use this Docker compose for the unit tests as opposed to the one we just went over in the manual example. The other part to that is we want to make sure we run our Dynamo within memory because we're not going to be using a file system in this case because it gets a little complicated when we're running this on a GitHub Actions runner. So we're going to keep that as in memory, and then we are going to run our test. But before we run our test, we just want to make sure that table is built. So we want to run that script prior to running our tests. And so that script is under scripts DynamoDB create table as such. Okay, and then the last part to this is we want to make sure we have all those environment variables we need for this to work correctly, which are very similar to the ones we set up when we were running it locally. And those are the AWS access key, which are just dummy variables for now because we're not actually using AWS, we're using the DynamoDB local setup, the region, which is also a dummy variable, and then the local endpoint. That is needed mainly by the script here that's running the create table. And then the go test will run, and then that's going to validate our test. So that's part one, which we ran when we were doing it manually. We ran this exact same command, but this sets it up for us. So just to quickly go over it, we essentially check out our repository into the GitHub Actions runner. We're using Ubuntu latest. We set up Go, so that Go is available in our GitHub Actions runner. That's this part here. We then run a Docker compose up, which is similar to what we did locally to make sure that we have a Dynamo database to run our unit tests, which our unit tests depend on. And then we have these environment variables, which are needed mainly for this script. So more or less, you can see why it was important to run this locally, because that more or less gave us what we needed to do in our test step. We just automating this in a GitHub Actions job step, and we call it test. The next step is the build and push image step. So that's going to be a separate job. So we can come here, have a build job, which will run on Ubuntu latest. Cursor here is trying to give us some potential fill-ins. It's not quite correct, but let's take some of it. Don't need to set up Go anymore. We do need the checkout, so that's a good thing. But what we need now is mainly all based off Docker. We're gonna use some community actions to build our Docker image. These community actions make it very easy to build and push the Docker image up to a registry. Okay, so the first one is Docker meta. We're gonna call it that, and this is just gonna provide a bunch of metadata for us so that it tags our image correctly. We can see that we want to tag our image with the branch. We also want to give it a SHA because we want it to be tagged with the SHA of the commit. And so this more or less is just providing the correct tags for us for our image for when we build the image. This isn't building the image, but it's setting us up so that we provide our image with tags that we can then utilize in our Docker compose file as the tag reference to the image. Okay, these next two are setup QEMU. These are mainly used so that we can have cross-platform builds. And the next one is we need to then log into a registry so that we can then build our image and push it to the registry. So just like we did when we were running it manually, we logged into the GitHub registry. We need to log into the GitHub registry in our automation as well. Okay, so for that we can use Docker login action, and that allows us to log in. And then lastly here, we just build and push. So build and push essentially will build our image and push it to the repository. Since we are now logged in, the push should work no problem. And so once again, these are all just community actions. And if you actually go over to this community action, this whole process is pretty much described here. So if we head over to the internet, this action here is the one that builds and pushes. And if you come here, you can kind of reference here, you can see it tells you, and you want to log in. It talks about like setting up QME and BuildX for cross-platform, and then the build and push. So a lot of this is already described in these readmes. Okay, so that does it for the build. And then the third part to this is essentially saying the continuous delivery, continuous deployment. And really, I'm going to talk in a little more detail about this in terms of what's the difference between continuous delivery versus continuous deployment. But what we're going to do in this particular pipeline is we're essentially going to create an automation that updates the Docker Compose tag to whatever was built in this step. And I'm going to call it delivery simply because what we're doing here is more the delivery aspect, not the deploy aspect. And so similar here, we will have the checkout, but any of these other suggestions are actually not correct. But let's just take them and delete them. So we can take the checkout. And then the next part here is what we want to do is we want to do what we did manually, which is simply update our tag to be whatever tag we just built in our automation. And I'm calling it delivery because, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next section here, but essentially it's delivery because really what we're going to do is we're essentially going to get our configuration ready, but it's not going to apply it to the deployment because to do that you have to run Docker Compose up. And so what this job delivery is going to do, it's just going to create a PR that's going to update the Docker Compose file with the latest tag that was just built. And we are going to use a community action for that as well. Okay, and so the community action we're going to use for this is just the FJ, I can't really pronounce this, but anyways, it's a YAML update community action that allows us to update a YAML file. So we head over to this, it describes it. Okay, and so yeah, essentially what this does is it allows us to update a YAML file, and that's what we're going to use it for. We're going to use it to update the Docker Compose file. And here it describes all the different inputs we can use. So if we head back over to cursor, and we can see, we can tell it the value file that you want to update, the property path within that value file. So is services user management service .image. So if we take a look at Docker Compose, we can see the services, user management .service, and then image is what we want to update, and we want to update that to be the latest tag. And so the way we do that, and if we go back to the action, is we use this reference to the GitHub repository owner login as well as the repository name. Now we're going to have to do something here because what's going to happen with this is it's going to create an error because it's going to capitalize the login. So we're going to need a way to grab these variables. When they get updated, they're not capital. We need to make sure that they're all lowercase. And we'll do that in just a sec, but let's just finish kind of going over what's happening here. Okay, so this here says when to commit the change. And we're essentially wanting this to happen only when it's not a pull request event. And the reason for this is we really only want this to take place whenever we merge in the release we're currently going to do. So whenever we are ready to release, we have the unit test will run, the image will build, but when it's a PR, there will be some basic running that will happen here. For example, I didn't really mention this. We will still build the image, but we won't push the registry unless we merge, because we really are not ready to push the image on a pull request event. We're only ready to image on a push event. So whenever we merge our latest code into our main branch, that's when the CI/CD pipeline is gonna fully run through and take our code to production. And so in this part here, we are updating the Docker Compose file. And what we're doing here is we're updating the Docker Compose file, but we're only doing that on a push event. So whenever changes to our service are going live and getting merged into the main branch. So similar here, our target branch is the main branch, but we wanted to create a PR. We don't necessarily want it to merge or make the commits to the main branch. So then we say create PR, and we want it only to do that when it is not a pull request event. So whenever the workflow running here is running on a push event, which is this one here. And the branch we want for that PR is the deploy PR, and we just need to provide the token with the permissions necessary to make the commit and make the PR, and then the message is going to be made when we make the PR. So that kind of sums it up. The last part to this whole process is we need to make sure that this workflow has the proper permissions to do all the stuff it needs to do. And so we can write a permissions block here. And this is giving us suggestions, though we don't need all this. We need contents right. We don't need ID token. We want pull requests right, issues right, and packages right. And this is to make sure that it can commit and make the PR. Though there is one more thing that's needed is by default, workflows are not actually allowed to create PRs. So you would need to go into the repository that you're currently using. And if you went to settings and you go to the actions, you will need to make sure that you allow GitHub Actions to create and approve pull requests, because if not, the action will not be allowed to create the pull request. So this needs to be checked. So just if you run into an error when you're running this workflow, it is probably because it's not checked. So as long as you have this checked and you have these permissions, the workflow should be able to run. So just to summarize, we did all this manually. Now we're putting all these manual processes into a workflow, and so we're automating the process. So first part here, we run the unit tests. So that's the go test, make sure that the service is ready to go to production. And this next part here builds the image and pushes it to the GitHub Docker registry. And then the delivery part is simply updating this Docker Compose file to use the latest tag that we just built so that it can be utilized in production. And for that, we do the GitHub SHA because we are including this SHA as one of our tags. And that is done here on the Docker meta. We use a tag with the SHA. So we make sure we have an image with the SHA, which is essentially the commit message, the commit SHA that kicked off the workflow. That gets placed as the image tag. And so we can utilize that to update our image to reference that particular tag. And now, like I mentioned, we want to make sure that this here is all lowercase, and by default this user owner will be whatever your user owner is set as, and in my case it's capital S and capital M for Samir Marin. So we want to make another step here that allows us to grab these variables, but we want to make sure they're lowercase. So the way we do that is we can have another job and we can say set image reference, and then what we do is we'll have an ID called image, so we can reference it in a sec. And then here we will grab these two variables, but we'll lowercase them. Okay, so what we can do here is we can use an owner lowercase, and we can lowercase it with bash and put it in our GitHub output, and then we can have a repo lowercase and we can lowercase it with bash. And we can grab them from our environment variables if we set them as environment variables here. And so then what we can do is, and actually Cursor is really good at this, we can say steps image outputs owner lowercase for this one, and then steps image outputs repo lowercase. And so that makes sure that these two are all lowercase, and when we update the YAML file, this reference will be fully lowercase. And once we've done that, we are pretty much done. So let's commit this up and watch the action run in GitHub. So head over to our to our terminal. Let's create a branch. We can call it the branch CI/CD pipeline, and then we can commit. So we want to add everything under GitHub, which is what we just created, which is under workflows. We want to add all that, so that adds our CI/CD pipeline. And then this was what we modified when we were doing the manual aspect, which is that tag. And we can also add that, that's no problem. So we updated it to CI/CD tag in the manual part. We can add that, and then we can commit this. And we can say create CI/CD pipeline, and we will push, and we will open up the pull request. Okay, so we can create this pull request, and because we did say this will run on a pull request event that's against the main branch, which is this is against the main branch, this will kick off our action, and here it is. And we can see that everything is actually running. So we did make a mistake because we do not want this all to run at once. We want this to run, then this to run, and this to run, because they sort of depend on each other. So that is a bit of an issue, but we can fix that. We can come back to our pipeline and we can have our test. Doesn't depend on anything, when not to run first, but then for these we can do a needs test, so that this essentially says, okay, so this will only run when the test one is done. And I believe this is an array, so we need to put that under brackets. And this one needs the build. So then this one will only run once the build is done. Because in theory, these all depend on each other. You shouldn't be running the build and the push image if the test didn't pass, because that means the tests were not successful. And you shouldn't be updating your Docker Compose with the latest image tag if the build wasn't successful either. So this will ensure that happens. So let's go back to the terminal and add that. So, oh, we did forget to add this part with the image reference as well. So we want to make sure we add that so that everything is lowercase, and that should do it. So then update our CI/CD pipeline. Let's push that. Okay, so now we should be good. So we want to look at this last one here. And we can see now that the test is running and this has not started because we placed those needs. So this build won't start till the test is done, and this delivery won't start till the build is done. But once again, the workflow that runs on the pull request event is limited because we are not wanting the pipeline to go all the way through. We're sort of just doing some validation. Yes, we want the test to run because if somebody's changing code in this repo, for example, and they're updating something in the user management services, it's good for the test to run and validate for them that the changes they made are good. So that's something that's good for it to run a pull request event. It's also good for the build to run, but not necessarily push it, because if the image builds correctly, it means that there's no breaking code changes that disallow the image from building correctly. But we don't really want to push it, because we only want to push it once we're ready to go to production, and that is once the code is merged into the main branch. And same with the delivery. We have some conditions here that we still want to validate that this would all work, the action is working correctly, but we don't want to make the commits unless it's not a pull request event, which is why we have these conditions here as well. Don't make the commit and don't make the PR unless it's not a pull request event. Okay, so back to the action. Our pipeline is still running. It's doing the build now. Now it's running the delivery step. Once the delivery step is done, we have essentially run our CI/CD pipeline. And at this point, when we merge, what should happen is the image right now has not been pushed. So if you come into the code and you go to packages, you'll see nothing has been pushed yet. The latest push is what we did manually, because our CI/CD pipeline is instructed to only push on a push event. But as soon as we merge this pull request, it will push the image, and it should also create a PR with an update to the Docker Compose. Okay, so let's merge this. This will kick off another action run. So we come into actions, and now this one is running off of the main branch, and it is a push event as opposed to a pull request event. And so this one is the full pipeline running. We run the tests, we run the build, we push the image to the Docker container registry, and then we update the Docker Compose with the latest image tag so that it's ready to go to production. So let's wait for that to finish and then validate that all happens. Okay, so the pipeline's done running. We ran the test, we ran the build, and we pushed, or it should have. We'll validate that in a sec. And then the delivery should have created a PR for us that updated the Docker Compose. Okay, so if we head over to our packages, we should see a new image tag got pushed up. And sure enough, it did. And so this is what I'm talking about, the SHA. So this is the commit SHA that triggered the action to run. And so that gets added as a tag. And so that is here now. And the other thing that should have happened is we should have updated the Docker Compose to reference this tag. So if we look in the pull requests, we can see that we created a pull request to update the Docker Compose to the latest tag, and this tag should match the tag we just pushed. And so we can see here that we have updated it to that tag, and that should be the tag that we just pushed up. So let's just make sure that's the case, and that is the case. And so that is a CI/CD pipeline. And so just to go over all the steps again, what we did was we ran the tests, and what the tests do is they validate that any changes to the service are not breaking changes. Now, obviously, this is as good as your unit tests are. If your unit tests don't cover every case, there could still be breaking changes. But the assumption here is the service writer writes the proper test that ensures, at least to the best of their abilities, that the service is valid. And so when we run this unit test, it gives us some confidence that what we build is not going to break production. The next part here is making that service ready for production. In our case here is building the Docker image and pushing it to the Docker registry, which we're using GitHub Docker registry in this case, and then it's available there for us to use. And then in our case, we're using Docker Compose to manage our deployments. And so here we're doing what we call a delivery, and the delivery really is we're updating the Docker Compose image to reference that latest build that just got pushed up during this particular CI/CD pipeline run. And so as you saw, in this case, a PR was created. And now the delivery aspect is really saying, okay, I've delivered up to the point where the tag is available. I've updated the configurations for the deployment to have that latest tag, but I haven't really pressed that button to say go live. There are many ways this can happen. In the case of when you're using Docker Compose, is if you are on the production machine and you run Docker Compose up, now Docker Compose says, okay, I'm gonna update this deployment to use whatever is in this Docker Compose file, and that's sort of pushing that button to say deploy it. Lately, this process has been offboarded to a different service outside of the CI/CD pipeline. So to back up a little bit, we could, for example, say, okay, let's extend this process so that now we SSH into the production machine. We've updated our Docker Compose file, so we merge the pull request with the Docker Compose update into the main branch. We can then SSH into the production machine, pull the latest branch, and then run a Docker Compose up, and all of a sudden we've deployed because the Docker Compose up makes sure that latest tag was pulled and it's now running what we have built in the CI/CD pipeline. So in that case, we would have done a continuous integration, continuous deployment, because now we press that deploy button. So the deployment button says, okay, this is running live. In our case, we've only gone up to the point of updating the configuration. So we call that delivery. Now, lately, there's been a move to offboard that deployment process to other tools. In the Kubernetes world, for example, there is Argo CD. And so the way Argo CD works is you update the Kubernetes configuration files to have that latest image, and you merge that into your GitHub repository. But then Argo CD is in charge of taking whatever is in the main branch of your repository and applying it to production. So it's in charge of doing the deployment. Once it gets merged into the main branch, it can automatically send it out and deploy for you. So that's kind of the process that's used more and more now. It's offboarding it to a separate service to do the deployment process. For Docker Compose, Argo CD doesn't really work. It's more of a Kubernetes world sort of thing. But in the Docker Compose world, there's services like Portainer. I haven't particularly used Portainer, but I believe that handles Docker Compose in a similar fashion, where it's washing a particular branch in your GitHub repository and then making the deployment happen, potentially automatically, depending on how you have things configured. But I guess the big thing to take away here is there's delivery and there's deployment. Delivery is essentially, I've gotten it up to the point where the configurations are updated so that the deployment can happen with the push of a button. Deployment is that button gets pushed so that the deployment is out in live. How that happens really depends. It could be an extension to the CI/CD pipeline we did now, like I said, by SSHing in and running Docker Compose up. But it could also be using another tool like Argo CD to make sure that Argo CD is washing whatever gets merged into the main branch and then updates the deployment to use the latest in that main branch. So that is a CI/CD pipeline. We went over how to do it manually, and then we took that manual process and made it happen in an automation in a GitHub Actions, which is our CI/CD pipeline. We did up to the delivery part, and then we covered that difference between delivery and deployment and what that means exactly. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm thinking of making another one on reusable workflows that's kind of extending this video. So stay tuned for that. And if you enjoy my content, check out some of my other content over here. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.